Hey guys, John here. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to talk about something that has been on my mind a little bit recently, and that is guitar QC or quality control issues. Has it gotten worse recently? I'm not sure, but I basically want to open a discussion with you guys, talk about it and hopefully share some experiences. So I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below regarding anything that is being discussed in this video or things that I should have added in your opinion. But I think that it's important that we talk about this sort of stuff because this basically is about your money. So I'm going to talk about some examples of bad QC, things that I've experienced myself throughout the years and things that I've, heard online. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about setup and what to look for when you buy a guitar and perhaps more specifically when you order a guitar online. Because when you buy a guitar in a store, you have the opportunity to, of course, look at the guitar yourself, hold it in your hands and all that stuff. But when you buy a guitar online, you're dependent on the QC of the store or the distributor or whatnot. Now, I'm not a guitar tech, okay? So if you want to know the answers to the questions in terms of how to fix some of these very specific issues, perhaps you should talk to a luthier or to a competent tech. I have experience, but I don't consider myself to be a professional tech at all. So please keep that in mind. And also, there are a lot of great guitars out there still. It's not like every guitar has QC issues or anything like that, but it's definitely something that just happens from time to time. And it's good to be aware and it's good to discuss these things so that everybody knows what's going on. And also so that the brands hopefully get a little bit more aware of the concerns that we have regarding this subject. Now, as I said, I'm not a professional tech, but I've learned some things myself. I've discussed some of those things on the channel throughout the years. I've learned to do some of these fixes myself, but we'll get to that. But some of the issues that we're going to discuss aren't things that you can fix yourself, basically. So anyway, all these things are important to know. Now, why do these things bug me so much, the QC issues on guitars? Well, first of all, we're giving these companies our money because we saved up some money, we worked hard to earn that money, and we want to buy a guitar to make us feel good, to feel inspired, to pick it up and play some awesome music, and to just have joy. So we're basically buying joy from those companies, kind of. And when you spend your money, whether it's a little, let's say 400 or 500 euros, or a lot, let's say around 5,000 euros, or maybe even more, it's the same thing. It's our hard-earned money. And we should get something that is worth that money, okay? You should not get something that is flawed. And that leads me to the point of, when are QC issues acceptable? And I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Is it acceptable for a 1,000 euro guitar to have some issues here and there or not? Or should guitars from a certain price point on, let's say 700 euros, have no issues at all? Is it acceptable for very expensive guitars from 3,000 euros and up to have small issues? I personally don't think so. I think that if a guitar is expensive, so let's say over 1,500 euros or so, it should be practically flawless. At least in terms of the functionality, okay? So in terms of the frets, the electronics and all that stuff. But I'd love to know your thoughts on that, okay? But I think that if a guitar is expensive, it has to be absolutely flawless, especially if it's a guitar that costs like, 5,000, 6,000 euros or even more, let alone guitars of like 3,000 euros. Those should be flawless, okay? Especially in terms of the sound, the electronics, the playability, and the fretwork. If a really expensive guitar has flaws, there's just no excuse. And sure, it can happen. It can happen. And of course, it's impossible for all those companies to make sure that every guitar that they sell is absolutely flawless. Of course, again, it can happen. So we have to stay reasonable here. But again, it's good to be aware of these things and to talk about it, okay? And another thing that bugs me is when I think of like the young player who saves up for a year and then buys his first expensive guitar. Let's say a young kid who buys a guitar that's like 1,000 euros or so, which is a lot of money for a young kid. I remember when I first got my serious guitar that was like, 800 euros, give or take. And that meant the world to me, okay, that guitar. I saved up for it so much, I didn't even consider that it could have flaws. But now when I buy a guitar or get a guitar or whatever, I always like look for the flaws and see if everything is okay before I feel like, okay, I have this guitar, I love this guitar. But again, back then, I didn't even consider those things. And when I think of a kid getting his first serious guitar and then, plugging it in and realizing, it doesn't really sound good, or it's not playing really nicely. Let me look up online how to set up a guitar. Okay, adjust the action. Whatever that person does, he can't get it right. That's what I think of. And that makes me sad. Because when you're inexperienced with setting up guitars or making like adjustments or little fixes, a lot of times you don't even realize that there's something wrong, but maybe you feel it. Maybe you notice that this guitar is just not really inspiring to me. That sort of idea bugs me out. Because you want somebody who's sort of starting out and who buys a cool guitar, who's saved up for that, to feel joy and to feel inspired by such an instrument. So getting a new guitar should be a wonderful experience. So QC issues can definitely take away some of the joy of that, and I'm sure you would agree. Now let's talk a little bit about why these QC issues can happen. And let's look at the chain from the factory to the buyer, okay? So when a guitar is being built in a factory, when they are building it, of course, there are some quality controls, I assume. I don't work in a factory, but I've watched some videos of guitar brands, how they make their guitars and stuff. And sometimes there are like multiple stages where they check the quality. And at the end of the line, when they put all the hardware on, put the strings on, tune the guitar and stuff, there's usually, or hopefully always, somebody who checks the guitar for issues. So that's a point where a QC issue can slip through. Maybe that's because they're like, we're not going to put this guitar back into the factory and let them fix it or even throw it away, because that's wasted money, right? And wasted time. And maybe they don't want to, waste their time and money to fix an instrument, and they decide just to ship it out in hopes that it will be bought by somebody who doesn't know about these issues and who will be happy regardless, right? So then the guitar gets shipped. Now, during shipping, stuff might occur because of poor handling, perhaps, but also because of temperature changes, moisture changes. Sometimes they make guitars in countries that are that have a very moisturized atmosphere, moist atmosphere, and then they ship them and they become very dry, and then the wood shrinks and it cracks and whatever. So stuff can happen during shipping, of course. But then usually the guitar ends up at a distributor. And then the distributors hopefully do QC checks, okay? Now, I know some people who work at distributors, and with some of them, I'm definitely aware that they check every single guitar, which is great. And in my opinion, very important for us, the customers. That after it's being shipped from the factory, they check the guitars again, especially if the guitars are expensive, okay? Just to see if the frets are okay, if the cosmetics are okay, if everything is in working order, stuff like that, if the electronics are okay, you know what I mean. And then usually the guitars get shipped to stores, whether it's a web store or like your normal mom and dad guitar store. Is that a thing? A store where you walk into and where you check out the guitars and buy a guitar. And then hopefully the stores will take the guitars out of the cases and inspect them again. But I know for a fact that this definitely doesn't always happen, especially with the big online retailers. A lot of times when I receive a guitar from a store like that, they're packaged in a way that just, where you can see like, okay, nobody has opened this guitar since it came either from the factory or the distributor. And sometimes you can notice that because of super high action or something like that, a very poor adjustment, things like that. Or where you just encounter an issue like, hey, if they would have plugged this guitar in, they would have noticed that the pickup isn't working. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. So I think that's a bummer. It's a bummer that the bigger stores especially don't always check the guitars for QC issues. And that's a bummer for us. But then again, it's also a bummer for them, because if a guitar turns out to have issues, people are going to return them, right? And then the companies hopefully are going to hear from that or hear about that and also feel like, that sucks. So when you get a guitar that has QC issues, what do? There are a couple of options. If the issues are very minor and you can fix it yourself, if you love that guitar, if you play it and you feel the guitar in your hands, and if it sounds good and you're like, I love this guitar so much, if you can fix it yourself, sure, that's what I do. If it's something that you can't fix yourself, you can either send it back to the store and say, hey, I want a new one, or I want you to fix this one. And you definitely have all the right to do that, of course. Or you can choose to, bring it to your local luthier and let them fix it, which sometimes is my preferred way, because if I love a guitar so much and it has some issues that I can't fix, sometimes I'll be like, you know what, I'll bring this to a luthier, let them fix it, and then I'll have the guitar that I wanted. Is that acceptable? I don't know. I mean, sometimes the stores will compensate you for that, but a lot of times they would prefer you to send it back yourself. But with the very big stores, I don't always have a good feeling about that. Who's going to take care of my guitar? What's going to happen? Will it be done well? Will I have to ship it back again and all that stuff? So it's a little bit of a hassle. But of course, all of this is up to you. So let me know what you would do depending on what sort of issues. So do you fix it? Do you accept it? Do you let someone fix it, or do you send it back? I guess that's all dependent on the issues that you might encounter. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some issues that I've encountered over the years and some things that I've seen online and stuff. And we're just going to sort of pretend that we're taking a guitar out of the box after we've received it, after having ordered one at an online store. Because as I said, that's of course very different than going to a store, trying a guitar out for yourself. Although sometimes you might notice some things after the fact when you bring it home, but let's stick with the ordering a guitar concept, okay? So the guitar gets home and maybe you'll have to wait a little bit for the box to cool down. I think that's a wise idea, just to let the guitar, get adjusted to the climate of your house. And then you open up the box and you grab the guitar. What's the first thing you do? Well, the first thing that I do is just take a look at the guitar. I'm going to grab this guitar just as an example. This is a killer LTD Eclipse CTM in Violet Shadow. Love this guitar. I'm just going to use this as an example. It does have some minor cosmetic issues, by the way. This guitar was made in Indonesia. It's a really cool guitar. Again, looks killer. So LTD makes guitars in Indonesia as well as Korea. And sometimes they have some QC issues here and there. There's no way around it, okay? So you grab the guitar and you take a look at the front, take a look at the back, just to see if there are any like obvious finish flaws or something, like scratches or dents. If I were to receive a guitar that has a big dent, that would be quite unacceptable. So in that case, I would probably send it back, unless it's like a very affordable guitar and if it plays like really well, you know what I mean? And I'm like, oh, it's such an inspiring instrument. In that case, what I would do is probably contact the store to see if I can get a discount, a reasonable discount. Anyway, so, cosmetic flaws, are they important? That's up to you. So again, I would love to know your thoughts. And I think it also would depend, on the flaw. I mean, if the binding, the line between the binding and the fretboard isn't completely flush, if there's like a little bit of finish leaking onto the binding or something like that, if it's like 100% purely cosmetic, it's not really an issue for me. I think this guitar has like a darker spot. You probably can't even see it on the camera. It has like a darker spot under the finish, as if it's like wood, glue or something, purely cosmetic. I don't mind that at all. Sometimes you'll see like scratches on the fretboard where there are like tool marks where they were like filing the frets or something. Usually cosmetic. I usually don't mind those type of things when I buy like import guitars for like between 800 and let's say 2,000 euros. As long as the guitar plays and sounds really well, a couple tool marks don't bug me per se. Another little issue that this guitar had is that there's some really you can't see this on camera, but there's some super small, or one area on the binding here where the finish flaked off a little bit. But I decided, that's acceptable for me because I like this guitar a lot, other than those little cosmetic things. But that's something to look for, and it's up to you to decide what you think is acceptable. Again, for me, when a guitar plays really well, when it looks killer and when it sounds great, if it's just a cosmetic issue, sometimes I will contact the store and say like, hey, I think this is unacceptable for a guitar of like, let's say 1,500 euros to have this issue. Maybe can you give me a discount or something like that? But if you're like, no, that's unacceptable for me. I saved up money for, years. I want to send this back. Do it. You have the right to have a good feeling about a guitar that you buy new. If there's a huge crack in your ebony fretboard, send it back, okay? That's not going to make you feel good. Talking about the fretboard and ebony especially, yeah, that sometimes happens. I got one guitar where there was like a pretty significant crack on the 4th fret. I even made a video about how I fixed that with super glue and stuff. Now it's all fixed, so it's fine. I just wanted to try that, so it was my choice to do that and to fix that guitar that way. But usually I would have said, hell no, send that guitar back. And that stuff can happen because of temperature changes, moisture changes and whatnot. But yeah, that's not a cool problem to have. I recently got a very expensive guitar actually that had a similar issue, but it was more like a hairline crack, so a very subtle crack spanning across, let's say, 4 frets or so. And that was an expensive guitar. And when I saw that, I was just like, I don't want to live with that in my mind. You know, it might get worse over the years. Maybe not. Maybe it's purely cosmetic, but it didn't feel good to me, so I returned it, okay? So, especially when you have an ebony fretboard guitar that you bought brand new, definitely check the fretboard for cracks and make sure that the humidity in your room is good, okay? As far as I understand, between 40 and 60% is like a good humidity level for the room where you store your guitars in. I have a humidity meter somewhere back there, and that's pretty convenient. So make sure that the humidity is good, especially for fretboards that are made out of ebony. And if you really love the guitar, aside from the crack, you can have it fixed, you know, if that's what you want. Maybe fix it yourself like I did. Don't do that if you have no idea what you're doing, obviously. But mostly what I would do is send a guitar back that has that issue. Now, the next thing that I would usually do is like grab a chord and sort of see how resonant the guitar is and if the wood is good. I know that some people don't care about that for some reason. I care about that a lot. The way the guitar resonates and the way it vibrates when you play it as you hold it in your hands is just very important, you know, to me. And it really defines how inspiring an instrument is sound-wise. Of course, the pickups also have to do with that, but even when I'm playing a guitar unplugged, I need it to resonate well, you know, and to sound good. That's just important. The acoustic properties of an electric guitar are important to me. Okay, so that's something that I check. If you get the feeling that your guitar is like very dead sounding, maybe that's not a good thing. I've sent a guitar back once that just was so dead sounding, even when I put new strings on it. That was just super unacceptable and very uninspiring, so I sent that back right away. For me, that's a huge deal breaker. Luckily, all the guitars that I have here have good wood, otherwise I wouldn't have them. But like resonance and the acoustic properties of an electric instrument, for me, are very important, so that's what I always check. You know, just a couple chords. Of course, it can also be the old factory strings that are still on there, so definitely perhaps try it with some new, fresh strings, tune it up and see if it's improved. Could also be hardware, so it could be like the nut, maybe the nut is too low or the material is bad, or maybe the bridge. But usually you can tell if the acoustic properties of an instrument are good or bad by just strumming some chords or even just doing like. All right, now then you plug the guitar in, you tune it up, and then you check if the electronics are working or not. Especially with an electric guitar, it's important that the electronics are working. Check the pots, see if they're working correctly, if they're scratchy or something like that. See if the pickups are working. One guitar that I got once, I mentioned this in the video of said guitar, I think it was like a 1,600 euro guitar or something, or 1,700 euro guitar. Or 2 times I actually had this, similar priced guitars, that the grounding wasn't done properly. So it was like super noisy no matter what I did. So the bridge wasn't properly grounded on those guitars. That's a huge bummer. Sometimes it's easy to fix yourself, other times not so much. In this case, I had to take off the bridge, take the studs out, and then make sure that the wire was making contact with the metal. And that was pretty daunting, but I just was determined to fix it myself. And in the end, I did fix it myself, but it was a little bit like, sending a guitar back all the way to another country because the grounding isn't good, man, that's a really annoying issue. If the store would have checked that guitar, they would probably have noticed that there was an issue. So again, please, stores, distributors, check the QC of the guitars. Now, if you have active pickups like these ones, these are the Fishmans, of course, if it doesn't sound good, it could also be the battery. So check it with a new battery and see if this problem persists. Now, in some cases, and I've also been bugged out about this a little bit, some of the guitars in a similar price range to this one have pickup selectors that just don't work anymore properly after a while. So maybe like the bottom position doesn't work or the top position. I don't know, maybe they're using like cheap switches, but that really bugs me out. Stuff like that should just work, okay? Anyway, so that's what I would do next. And again, it's up to you to see if you can fix it yourself, let somebody else fix it, or just send it back. But especially with an electric guitar, especially when it's priced over €1,000, maybe less, all electronics should be perfect. Of course, I totally forgot to mention something that you should also check on guitars with two-pneumatic bridges, and I made a special dedicated video regarding this subject recently, and it's about collapsing bridges. Now, again, this is probably something that only happens with two-pneumatic style bridges, like this one. But if you get a new guitar with a two-pneumatic bridge, or even after a while, check to see if the bridge isn't collapsed, and I'll put a link to that specific video up here or in the comments down below so you can see what I'm talking about here. I forgot to mention it in this video, but I wanted to add this quick little note. Now, this is a big one, the frets, and this is something that is so important to me. So what I do next is I put some fresh strings on there and I set up the guitar to my liking. Now, what I like to do, it also depends on your personal preferences and the gauges that you like to use. For me, a lot of my guitars are like an E flat or drop C sharp, and I use 10s for that. If I put a guitar in E, like a standard 6-string guitar, I tend to use 10s as well, but for my 8-string guitars or stuff like that, I do use 9s because the scale length is just longer. But that's personal preference, okay? And then I set up the action. So I put the bridge to the proper height, or the saddles, and the bow of the neck. I like to have a pretty flat neck, pretty flat, almost completely flat. There have been cases where a guitar has had a perfectly flat neck with great action. That's impressive. But usually I tend to have a little bit of bow. You can check that by, holding down the first string with your index finger on the first fret, and then near where the neck meets the body, and tap gently to see if there's a little bit of clearance. I also tend to do it by eye just to look how much of clearance there is, and this is just based on my personal experience because I have many guitars and I know how I set up my guitars so that I think they feel good to play for my own preference. Now at this point, you may start to notice that the strings are buzzing in some areas. Maybe like one string on a certain fret or multiple strings on a certain fret. It could be the case that the frets aren't perfectly level, and this does happen. Sometimes it happens within like acceptable tolerances so that you can still get a good action without too much fret buzz, but sometimes it's completely unacceptable. Sometimes it happens up here, sometimes down here. Now, if it's just like one fret in one area, I tend to fix it myself. I know how to do those things. I do not know how to do a full fret level. That's just above my pay grade. If I notice that a guitar has multiple issues across the neck, usually I would just send it back because it's too much of a hassle. But yeah, it's important that all the frets are level so that you can get the action that you want out of a guitar, within reason, of course. I mean, if you lower a guitar with perfect frets too much, it's gonna start buzzing also. Now, there's a way that you can check this. This is a fret rocker. This is a Warwick or a Framus fret rocker, and you can use this to see if the frets are too high. So you just put this, on a couple frets and see if it rocks. And if you hear it like tick, 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 rocking a little bit, then it can mean that your fret is too high. And then you can either fix it yourself, only if you know what you're doing, or take it to a luthier, or send it back to the store. If you're having issues with your setup, it might not be an issue, okay? It might not be an issue with your playing style or with your setup. So it's kind of hard for me to determine when that's an issue for you. Personally, I like low action, so I don't like it when frets are up too high. I start to notice it with my personal setups, and I don't like that. It takes the joy out of the playing of that instrument. So it might be worth getting one of these just so you can check it for yourself when you're noticing some issues when you're setting up your guitar. I'm not going to go super specific into the details of how I set up my guitars precisely, just give you a couple pointers here and there. Now, in some cases, and this has happened more than once for me, you'll notice that the strings are buzzing in the open. When a string is just played openly like this. Now, a little bit of buzz, like a little bit of A little bit of that is very acceptable for me because you don't really hear it when you're amplifying your guitar. Especially since I like my action low, that just tends to happen. But when it happens when your neck is already bowed a little bit, there's a chance that the nut slot or the entire nut is too low. Now in some cases I fixed this myself by raising a nut slot. It can be an easy fix if you know what you're doing, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to have to get that fixed. Right now, one of my guitars, a 3,000 euro guitar, is at a luthier because the nut was just cut a little bit too low, and it was causing one or two of the strings just to sound a little bit too dead in the open position, if you know what I mean. So yeah, a nut should be cut properly. Otherwise, you're never going to get a good setup that sounds good. So look for that as well. If you don't know what you're doing, bring it to a luthier or a competent tech to let them check if the nut is cut properly. You can do a check where you hold down like the third fret and then tap on the string. And if you hear a little clicking noise, there's some clearance there, which is good. Too much clearance isn't good, but a little bit of clearance is good. If there isn't a tapping noise and if the string lies flat on the fret, then there's a good chance that the nut slot might be too low, and that's not good. And again, that just happens more than I would like to see on guitars. But luckily, if it's like one or two strings and it's like a nut like this with deeper slots, I usually can fix it myself. Now, I haven't really had issues with tuners, but I know that some friends of mine have had issues with tuners. Of course, you need to check if your guitar stays in tune properly or not. If it doesn't, it might be the tuners and they might need replacing. So that's also something to check. Of course, you have to stretch the strings before you think about that stuff. Make sure that the strings are properly stretched before you make any judgment about how well the guitar stays in tune. Perhaps also make sure that the nut is properly smooth, properly lubed, because that can also cause the strings to get stuck in the nuts, and that can also cause tuning instability issues. So tune, bend until the note is on the proper, tuning. Truss rods can also cause some issues sometimes. Sometimes they rattle inside of a neck. That's really annoying. I really don't like that. If a guitar did that with me adjusting it as well, I'm putting it in the perfect position and it still would rattle, I would send it back. Luckily, it doesn't happen that often, but that's something to be aware of. Let alone just other hardware rattling and stuff. Sometimes you can fix these things yourself, luckily. And other times, sometimes truss rods just don't work properly and you can't get the neck to go straight enough. And that's a problem. That's definitely a reason to send the guitar back for me. The truss rod needs to work perfectly on any electric guitar. Otherwise, it might be impossible to get a proper setup on that guitar. Anyway, so those are some things that I look for when I get a guitar in terms of the QC issues. There might be more things that you deem important, so let me know in the comments. Please, let's open a discussion here. Now, is it important when you receive a guitar that it is set up well from the factory or distributor or the store? I can do a setup myself, but for the young player who we mentioned earlier, who's just getting his first guitar, I think it's important that when he gets that guitar, it's set up properly so that you're like, feeling inspired when you pick up that guitar for the first time. You can just start making music right away. I think for expensive guitars, let's say 2,000 euros and up, I would love to see guitars with a good setup, or at least a proper setup before them shipping them out. For cheaper guitars, I guess it's acceptable when it's not properly set up, for cheap guitars, but not everybody knows how to set up a guitar. So I would love to see it being more of a standard that when you buy a guitar, aside from the price range, that it's set up at least a little bit properly for playing. Sometimes the strings are up just so high and the neck is bowed so much that it doesn't play well. And then it takes some adjusting. It takes time to adjust the guitar until it plays well. And I'd love to see more guitars being set up properly in the factory, as well as intonation and stuff like that, even though intonating a guitar usually isn't that hard. But let me know your thoughts regarding that subject. So this video is becoming way too long already. I hope you found this useful. I hope there's something to talk about here. I hope the brands are listening. let your voice be heard. What do you think is acceptable? You know, all the things we discussed. I'd love to know your thoughts, so be sure to drop your thoughts on this subject in the comments down below. If you want to support the channel, you can buy something at my affiliate links for Tolman and Sweetwater. You get to support that channel at no additional cost that way. That would really help. And of course, also hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, as that also really helps the channel out. I'd really appreciate it. And you can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Ko-Fi, where I sell quad cortex captures. Okay, sorry for the rant. I hope this in some way was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this, and stay tuned for the next video. Cheers, guys.